Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 13th meeting. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce Lord Simon McDonald. You've been aware of his distinguished career for many months now, so I won't go through all the details, but you are well aware of his extensive role as a diplomat, leading to the highest office in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And subsequently, of course, he's Master of a college at Cambridge, which he may or may not talk about. What I would like to remind some of you is that this is not the first time we've met Simon McDonald, because he was one of the early speakers when we were World Affairs Digital and carried through with very large audiences for 2 years. And Simon is unique, actually, amongst hundreds of speakers that I've invited, because usually I send them a letter saying, would you like to come and speak about A, B, C, or D? And I give them a little prompt, and they write back or contact me to say, yes, I'd be very happy to talk about C. Or they say, no, I'd rather the title of the talk was E. Simon uniquely replied and said, I'd be very happy to talk about A, B, C, or D. Just ask your members which they would prefer. And it's the only time we've ever done a quick mini-survey, and you decided what he'd speak about. And he did so with great effectiveness on that occasion. Now here he is in the Westminster Theatre for the first time, and we haven't done that because Simon has written a book which is central to our thoughts. As you probably already found out, it's called Beyond Britannia, Reshaping UK Foreign Policy. And it fits in beautifully with our long-running theme about Britain's place in the world. And Simon has extensively thought about this issue throughout his career, and he's taken the opportunity to crystallize some rather provocative thoughts in his book about what Britain should be doing as it casts off its imperial past. And you'll have the other good thing about it is he's managed to condense all these thoughts into 250 pages, which in itself is admirable for all of us. So I hope you'll take the opportunity after the talk of meeting Simon at the Nantwich book desk, and we'll be pleased to put his signature on your copy. And of course, he's looking forward to your questions in the Q&A. He relishes that. And I just ought to remind you is that the talk will be recorded, but the Q&A will be just for us. Without further ado, please welcome Lord Simon McDonald.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. That was a very generous introduction. But what you don't appreciate is that I always treat speech titles as the vaguest guidance. And so it really doesn't matter what the title is. I just say what's on my mind, and that is what's going to happen this evening. So thank you for giving me such a good platform and such a large audience to indulge myself. I have a confession to make at the start, which is this is my first time in Keele. The second confession is for many years in my young life, I thought Keele was motorway services on the M6 and nothing else. But even though this is the first time I've visited the university, Keele played an important part in my life. And in my first book, I tell the story, because when I was at school, when I was 16 years old, in Salford, I went to the careers office, which was basically a cubbyhole with one metal cabinet in it. And I riffled through the drawers, and I found a brochure about the Foreign Office. And aged 16, I had assumed that the Foreign Office was only for people who had titles and went to Eton and Harrow. And even though that was wrong, it wasn't completely wrong when I was reading it. But this was the 1970s, and of course the Foreign Office was trying to change its image. So it used the stories of more interesting diplomats to try and hook others. And I remember very distinctly reading the story of someone from the north of England who went to Keele University and got into the Foreign Office where he was on posting to Afghanistan. And I thought, well, if he can do it, I'm going to try. And 5 years later, I got into the Foreign Office myself. So I am indirectly very grateful to Keele University. The next things I have to say are things that bind Keele and Salford, which is my hometown. Because when I was growing up in what I think is a wonderful country, its wonder wasn't the most obvious attribute. Because Salford in the 1970s was a completely depressed place. The pits had closed, the cotton mills had closed, the industrial architecture had been neglected, the canals were full of prams and supermarket trolleys, and it felt like a miserable place. So joining the Foreign Office and getting my head around our self-view as not only an important player, but the key player on the world stage was quite a cultural shock, because it didn't at all resonate with my own background. So whereas many British diplomats, I would say, have to get used to their country not being as grand as they thought when they were kids, my journey was curiously the other way around. So I've been puzzling about our role on the world stage for all my career. And now at the end, and I've had time to reflect and write, I've come to a sort of balance that we're not as great as we were, and we're not as great as some particularly right-wing politicians want us to believe, but we are still a great country, and there are things about our country that are as good or better than anything in the world, anywhere else in the world. And that, in 2 sentences, is the theme of my book. Now, I will flesh that out. One reason why we found it difficult to adjust to a different position in the world is that in olden times, by which I mean before the Second World War, we were top nation. And we were top nation because we had more colonies than anybody else, and we had more considerable armed forces than everybody else. So our topness was all vested in hard power. And hard power is traditionally how we judge what's serious and what is not serious on the international stage. And now, as we get into the middle of the 21st century, we're still struggling with the idea that hard power is not the be-all and end-all of international affairs and our role in the international community. And that struggle is happening right now. And I want to illustrate this struggle with an example which is in the papers at the minute, and that example is the Chagos Archipelago. So the Chagos Archipelago was part of the British Empire. It was part of the British Indian Ocean territories. And in the 1960s and 1970s, we were leaving our empire at speed. And the Chagos Archipelago was wrapped up in that too-quick process and has been an anomaly, even a thorn in our side for the last 60 years. At the end of last year, the newish Labour government announced a deal, that they had come to a deal with Mauritius about the future of the archipelago after a long negotiation which had started under the Conservative government. But the Conservatives in opposition, more or less to a man and woman, said this was terrible. This was a humiliation. This was a betrayal of Britain's interests. And they made three contentions, and I'm going to examine all three, and spoiler alert, all three are complete nonsense. So the first was that as an issue, the Chagos archipelago was sorted in the 1960s and 1970s. That as the UK left, we did a deal with the new government in Mauritius. We gave them £3 million in order to keep the Chagos archipelago, and in the view of some, that was job done. Well, let us pause. The idea that £3 million was proper recompense for a vast tract in the Indian Ocean is not sustainable. We were able to drive that bargain because we were very much bigger and stronger than the Mauritian government. And it's not only in international tribunals that legal processes protect the weak. And so people can be protected after making a deal that was obviously disadvantageous to them. Also part of the legal point is the controversy of splitting up a colony as we left. There are almost no rules to decolonization, but one that there is, which is protected by the Fourth Committee of the UN General Assembly, is that the colonial power is not allowed to split up the colony as it leaves, because usually that split is to divide and rule or to protect the colonial power's interest. Of course, the British Indian Ocean was split up, and whether that was justified or not, this has been a nagging problem for 60 years. Part of the split was quite easily accepted because the colony had been so big and so varied that the population centers in the Seychelles and the Maldives were given independence uncontroversially, but the Chagos archipelago was relatively unpopulated, not able to sustain independence by itself, and so, according to the rules, that should have remained with Mauritius, and that is the claim that they have been making year in and year out, and which has latterly caused us the problems we've had. So the first contention is that this was something sorted a long time ago, and I hope I'm demonstrating it absolutely was not. The Mauritians were never happy, and over decades they got the rest of the international community to agree with them, to the point where there was a legal case in the last decade when the International Court of Justice took a look. So the second contention is that the legal process was not legitimate and is not binding. Now, the idea that it is not legitimate goes to how the International Court of Justice was set up. And of course, we were a very strong power in the immediate post-war period, so we wrote in various rules to suit ourselves. And one of those rules was that the ICJ should not interfere in disputes between the United Kingdom and its former colonies, the Commonwealth. So that is there in black and white, absolutely true. But as I say, that was written a long time ago. We used that argument for years and years to fend off a legal process. But in 2019, we conceded that the argument was time expired, and so we went into a legal process. So my contention is, having made that concession, you can't unmake it when you don't like the result. So even though, formally speaking, we can say the ICJ has no standing, we allowed a process to proceed, and that is the key fact. The second legal point is that the judgment was not an actual judgment. It was only an advisory opinion. So this means we can ignore it. There are massive problems with that. One of the things that keeps the international system healthy and respected is that people abide by the rules. If big countries decide that they will not abide by the rules when they don't like them, then you end up with Ukraine, or dare I say it, Greenland. And so we need to play by the rules. And the fact that it is advisory does not give us proper protection. And even if that's your way of thinking, other procedures are available and will be used where the outcome has more a sense of obligation. So all those arguments about the legality, I think, fall away. The third contention is that by making this deal with Mauritius, the United Kingdom is undermining the security of the West because it is allowing China to get a foothold in the strategically important Indian Ocean. To make this contention, you have to know nothing about Mauritius. Mauritius is a country in the southern Indian Ocean, historically very close to India. Indeed, most of the political class is ethnically Indian. Successive prime ministers have all come from Indian families, and its orientation is Delhi rather than Beijing. As well as that historical point, there is the current point that the Chinese have their Belt and Road Initiative, which is trying to draw in countries to be dependent on China. There are 55 members of the African Union, and Mauritius is one of only 2 which is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there is no evidence that Mauritius is close to China or will throw in the towel to China, but this point is made repeatedly and often in interviews that I hear not challenged. The key point is that this negotiation was one that was conducted with the United States. At every step, they knew what was going on. And when the negotiation was announced, when the result was announced, the President of the United States embraced it. He said this was a good deal for the US and for the West because it protected the base at Diego Garcia for at least 99 years. And in my line of work, 99 years is a long time. So something well worth having. So I think all of these things show that we need to think more realistically about our hard power, to think more modestly about what we want from our hard power, more honest. Of course, the deal over Diego Garcia is back in the news because we have a new president of the United States. And Donald Trump is, as I will say later, capable of absolutely anything. And he may be persuaded to junk the deal. I hope that the British government gets the chance to make the points that I've just made, and that the main advisors to the president will not be people like Nigel Farage and close to Nigel Farage. So, if you accept that hard power is not the future, or is not the central plank of the UK's role in the world, and second, you think that the UK still has a role in the world, what then are the features of that global role? And that is the meat of the book that Bill was talking about, because I believe that the UK still has a series of things to offer which command not only attention but respect in other countries. And lumped together, I call all of this soft power. The first of my magnificent seven is our judiciary. The English, or wider British judiciary, has the highest reputation of any in the world. And I can say that boldly here in England, but I would say that on any platform anywhere in the world. And people would understand why. Because the evidence that it is so widely respected is that the whole world comes to the UK, particularly London, for arbitration. So if you are a multinational company or you are a government and you have an important dispute involving billions of dollars, the judges, the lawyers that you trust to make the case most objectively are British. And once an arbitration is being taken in the UK, all the appellate stages are also taken in the UK. So one of the main lines of work for our Supreme Court is adjudicating these international disputes. It doesn't get a lot of profile, but the role of our judges and courts is one way where the UK plays a role that the whole of the rest of the world values and pays attention to. So the judiciary, I always put in first place. Second, I'm going to use Westminster Hall as my prop, because the second is our education system, particularly our universities. The British universities consistently rank better than particularly other European universities in the world rankings. The British universities attract talent from across the world. Every year, a survey is done of heads of state and government in the world. There are 193 members of the United Nations, and more than 1/4 of them have studied in the United Kingdom. So 1/4 of the people running governments around the world were educated at places like Keele and Cambridge and Russell Group universities. This is a huge multiplier effect for the United Kingdom. It's not only the politicians, it's also the scientists, the businessmen, and other parts of the world come here, they learn their trade, and they never forget the debt. So, as mentioned, I'm the head of a Cambridge college. All Cambridge colleges need to rely on the generosity of their alumni to keep going. The one that keeps us going is an Indian who studied in Christ in the 1950s. He's made a huge amount of money in his life. He knows that he's made that money from the work and the research he did whilst he was at Cambridge, and now he's in a position to give back. He is doing so, shall I say, very satisfactorily. But our universities are a gem in our soft power. Third, and is really quite closely related, is our niche engineering and science that we have not only in our universities, but in private enterprise, in research campuses, the best or among the best. I don't want to overclaim. I'm always, one of the problems with British diplomats is that we overclaim. So we have among the best in the world. When you consider the fact that in Cambridge, most of the academics, or most of the people with PhDs, are nothing to do with the university. There are 5,000 PhDs in the city of Cambridge who are working for companies like AstraZeneca in their research park. and they are all bringing in foreign exchange and adding to the reputation of the United Kingdom. One of these characters is a man called David Kleneman. He's a Fellow of Christ, and I hope before the end of this year he'll have won a Nobel Prize. So niche science engineering, very important for the UK. Fourth is creativity. Our arts, culture, advertising, these are leaders in the world. And I can illustrate this with a very contemporary example, because in the last few years, more people get their entertainment from Netflix. And Netflix will spend this decade more than $5 billion on production in the United Kingdom. So this is their biggest production center. You look at the West End of London. Right now, tonight, as we're meeting, 50,000 people are going to the theatre in London. It is one of the two most vibrant cities of theatre in the world. It brings in enormous numbers of tourists and foreign exchange and adds to our reputation. And when you consider that the Oscars are, America's moment to reward American talent, it is significant that there are always Brits nominated in the major categories. And this year we have Ralph Fiennes, who we hope might get Best Actor. So our culture, our creativity is a vital part of our soft power. Number five is the one that surprises people. Diplomats wear suits, they look like me. But one of the things that most shapes our international reputation is sport. And the fact is that of the 10 most popular team sports in the world, 7 of them were codified in the UK. Other people get irritated when we say football's coming home, but it's true that association football started in the UK and is still governed in the UK. Golf started in Scotland, and the R&A, based in a small house in St Andrews, still has that sport in the grip of its hand because we were the beginners. So it's not just the origins, it's also how we organize. Football is by far the most popular sport around the world. Most football leagues are, shall we say, predictable or boring. But in England, there are half a dozen teams that compete for the Premiership each year. And in the last 10 years, we had the amazing feat of Leicester City, who were 2,000 to 1 outsiders at the start of the 2015-16 season and ended up winning the Premiership. Another feature of British sport is that locals are really, really loyal to their teams. And so in Leicester that year, there were a group of people who were not daunted by the odds of 2,000 to 1 and put on 10 quid, and they made a lot of money. So sport is something that drives and shapes and helps our reputation. 6, we're almost getting there, we're almost at the end. 6 is maybe another surprise, which is our media. The media landscape is getting more and more complicated. There are so many sources of information that it is more and more difficult to choose who to trust. But British institutions, British newspapers, British channels have a very strong brand around the world. all of them controversial. You know, nobody is universally loved, but the BBC gets 400 million listeners and viewers around the world every month. I used to work for Jack Straw 20 years ago, and his favorite colleague amongst other foreign ministers was Colin Powell. And at one of their meetings, Colin told Jack, every morning when I get up, I fire up my computer and I check the BBC News website, because that will guide me accurately what really matters and what are the key facts. So that is a very important thing for the UK as a whole, and is replicated also with our newspapers. I am going to confess, I am not a particular fan of the Daily Mail, but we have the Financial Times, and we have the Economist, and these are newspapers that have global reputations. If you are a business person, no matter where you are in the world, the FT will be your first source of information. And that kind of reputation is good for the country where the FT is based. The last of my Magnificent Seven, and this is a cheat because I so liked the idea of a Magnificent Seven that I sort of grouped some things together and put them under the heading institutions. Around the world again, institutions, especially of government, are under pressure. In some countries, their institutions are visibly buckling. But I think in the UK, we still have institutions that command general, if not universal, respect. And I start with the monarchy. The monarchy is an institution that most Brits just take for granted. If you're my age, until 2.5 years ago, Elizabeth II was the only person we'd ever seen be monarch of the United Kingdom. So it's familiar and comfortable, but my contention is it's very, very valuable for us as a country, because the monarchy brings together all sorts of things which cause huge problems elsewhere and ties them up in an apolitical, above-party institution. So the armed forces and the civil service, they look to the king. Their commissions are from the king. Their ultimate loyalty is to the king. And we all know that in this context, the king means the country. But the key for us, the key for our political stability is that the person is not a president, is not somebody in the political game who might want to use those institutions for his or her personal benefit. Now, the character that's going to feature most in the rest of my time is Donald Trump. Remember, this is only day 10 of his second administration. But one of the remarkable things that he's done in those first 10 days is get his own back against the people he thinks were problems first time round. And one of those people is called General Milley. General Milley was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top US general, the top US military person. And in the last 10 days, his photograph has been removed from all Pentagon buildings because he is being sort of airbrushed out of history, and the president is considering an investigation into whether the country's top general was doing the job he, the president, thought. So this is a politicization of the military, which I think is, frankly, a dangerous road to go down, and the way we are set up protects us from that. The second institution, and I confess to personal partiality, is the civil service. The civil service comes in for a lot of flack. I read a tweet this week from a right-wing commentator, and it just read, "Sir Humphrey delenda est," which means Sir Humphrey must be destroyed. It felt quite personal. But the civil service is the institution that is the memory for our government. It is important that governments cannot sack all the senior civil servants when they come into office. And at the beginning, quite a few governments are tempted, I've seen that, but they learn that civil servants define themselves by their impartiality and objectivity. They work for the government of the day. They work for the government the electorate put into power in Westminster, and they work selflessly for that government. And over time, that experience and objectivity, I think, has served the country very well. I'm prepared to take questions on this. I can see that's one of the more controversial things I've said so far. The last of the institutions, which may not be very popular but has been very successful, is the City of London. The City of London, over centuries, has been the world's main capital market, has been a huge generator of tax, other revenues for the government of the United Kingdom. The City of London has written the regulation that most of the rest of the world has then adopted for itself concerning financial institutions. When we were part of the EU, we performed that function for the EU. Now we're not, we don't. But the City of London, I think, remains a key part of the British offer. So I take all of these things and I submit that we have the material to look at again at our role in the world, to jettison the sort of nostalgic view that hard power is the only legitimate way to gauge your worth internationally, and to decide that by focusing on what we're really good at, we can have a wider role than within our own borders. And in the minutes that remain to me, the study case I want to advance is how we cope with Donald Trump. Because he is the most considerable actor on the world stage today. He is approaching his job like no other president in history, including himself. That his first administration was very different from this, because in his first administration, he didn't really know what he was doing. He didn't really know what he wanted to achieve because he was so surprised to win. This time, he has a plan, and the first 10 days show that he is going to execute. Now, at this point, one of the problems with dealing with talking about Donald Trump is that too many people think insane, bad, disengage. But I think we have to take all his pronouncements seriously, and we should weigh them on their merits. And the study case for this is Greenland. Everybody, I guess, in this hall has heard the new president say that he wants Greenland. He thinks it should be US territory. And of course, internationally, there is shock because we're not used to this way of behaving. It's kind of bullying and entitled and out of a clear blue sky. So in Europe, people said, no. I invite you to pause, because even though this is a shock, it is not outrageous. There is a case to be made for looking again at how Greenland fits into the international order. And it's because of recent changes, that the Arctic is much more important strategically in the world than it was even at the start of this century. Climate change has a lot to do with that. Also, the scarcity of precious metals and other minerals, which are apparently found in abundance in Greenland. It's also the idea of buying territory, absolutely American. This is the main way the United States has expanded over the last 250 years. The single biggest purchase so far was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 from Napoleonic France. The most famous probably was Alaska in 1867, when Seward spent 2 cents an acre acquiring the biggest state in the Union. Also relevant is the fact that the last significant purchase was in 1917, when the Americans bought the Danish West Indies, which are now the US Virgin Islands. So someone will have told Trump this, purchase is a way that you can expand, and the Danes have engaged in this in the past. You also need to consider, can the Greenlanders and the Danes with the Greenlanders look after themselves? They are very vulnerable. Denmark does not have an army that can see off a hostile Russia or China in the high Arctic. So is a Danish suzerainty the most sensible for the West? Or would Americans do it better? And the last point, which nobody in the UK is really focusing on, is what the Greenlanders themselves want. I've been to Greenland, and I've studied it a bit. One thing I know is they don't much like Denmark. You may know that the Danes have a new king called Frederick, and he paid his inaugural visit to Greenland at the end of last year, and no Greenland leader would meet him. So again, if you look at the people, this is an idea that may have legs. There are only 56,000 Greenlanders. And bribery is also a way of doing business on the international stage. If they were offered citizenship to the United States, if they could make their lives in Chicago or Dallas rather than Nuuk or Ilulissat, they may well be interested. So this is one of those things where you say, oh, it's a shock. But it's worth delving, it's worth engaging, because there is substance. So that is as positive as I can be about the new administration, because I think in too many areas, Mr. Trump is questioning things for which are not only widely believed, they're solidly believed. They're believed because of a body of evidence. And so I put into this category what he thinks about environment policy and climate change. His billionaire friends don't like it. This is a constraint on them, so they just say it's false. They want to set it aside. But I think that is too important for us simply to accept. So my final points are where the UK engages in this. We have traditionally been the hinge across the Atlantic between the US and Europe. I think that is a role that we should seek and embrace again. And I think it's one where, oddly, both of the other parties are quite interested in a British role. That President Trump, when he looks at Europe, sees 2 things principally: the European Union, which he hates, and the United Kingdom, which he kind of thinks is okay. One of the reasons he thinks it's okay is that his mother, Mary MacLeod, was born in Stornoway, and he has a personal affinity for Scotland. He's bought quite a few Scottish golf courses to prove it. I think that it probably would help the relationship if the RNA were to reinstate Turnberry in the rotation for the Open Golf tournament, but that's a separate conversation. But he respects the UK. The international leader whom he has the most active correspondence with is King Charles. This is another link into the United States. On the other hand, the Europeans, even though they are still sore that we voted to leave the European Union, see that in this particular policy challenge, they need the United Kingdom. They need the United Kingdom because if the Americans decide to leave NATO, if Europe is to be by itself, defending itself, then European defense has to have the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom's armed forces are the biggest and most capable in Europe. And they also think they need the Brits because we can talk American, that we have been controversial, it hasn't been easy, but we have been studying Trump. We have our lines into Trump. Our ambassador now departing Washington was the ambassador with the best relations, not only with him, but with his team. And though already people in Brussels and Paris and Berlin are getting in touch with London because they see the help that the UK can give them and us in dealing with this most extraordinary of presidents. And so I think that whole package means that there is life beyond Britannia and that the United Kingdom can still be an interesting, relevant, flexible, imaginative player on the international stage. Thank you very much indeed.